Good evening, I'm Lawrence O'Donnell, and tonight we begin with a story that has sent shockwaves through the Middle East and beyond. Israeli pilots captured in Yemen. This is not just another headline, it is a turning point, one that could reshape alliances, military strategies, and perhaps even the fragile balance of power in the region. When the news first broke, it didn't sound real. Israeli pilots, some of the most highly trained in the world, falling into the hands of Yemeni forces. But tonight, the evidence is undeniable, and the questions are even bigger than the story itself. How did this happen? What does it mean for Israel, for Yemen, and for the United States? And perhaps the most pressing question of all, what comes next? Israeli pilots are regarded as some of the toughest, most disciplined, and technologically supported aviators anywhere in the world. For decades, Israel has built a reputation of air superiority, a reputation now shaken by this extraordinary capture. Yemeni forces, long underestimated, now have in their custody symbols of Israeli power. And the symbolism is not lost on anyone. Israeli pilots are considered among the finest aviators in the world, a force trained and equipped to operate with precision under the most difficult circumstances. For decades, Israel's Air Force has built a reputation of being nearly untouchable, with its pilots representing the pinnacle of military training, discipline, and technological superiority. That reputation was shaken when reports emerged that several Israeli pilots had been captured in Yemen, an event that not only shocked the region but stunned the global security community. This is not just a military development, it is a seismic moment in the politics of power and perception. When a nation's greatest strength is suddenly exposed, the entire balance of confidence and deterrence begins to shift. And tonight, the world is watching. The very idea of Israeli pilots falling into enemy hands seems almost unthinkable. Israel's Air Force has long been its shield and its sword, providing both defense and deterrence against enemies who outnumber the country in population and geography. These pilots are the embodiment of that power, operating cutting-edge aircraft and armed with intelligence support that most nations could only dream of. Yet here we are, facing the undeniable fact that pilots who symbolized Israeli strength are now being paraded as captives in Yemen. How did this happen? What vulnerabilities were exploited? And perhaps most importantly, what does this say about the future of warfare in the region? The capture itself is more than just a tactical event. It is a psychological blow, one that travels faster than any missile and cuts deeper than any airstrike. Imagine for a moment the effect this has on the Israeli public, who have long believed that their pilots are untouchable in the skies. That belief has been part of Israel's national identity, part of its security narrative. Now, with images and reports emerging from Yemen, that belief is being shaken in real time, and it isn't just the Israeli public who is watching. From Tehran to Riyadh, from Washington to Moscow, leaders are studying this moment, recalculating their assumptions, and wondering what this capture reveals about the future. There is also a question of strategy. Yemeni forces, often underestimated and dismissed as irregular fighters, have demonstrated a capability that few believe possible. By capturing Israeli pilots, they have pierced through decades of military mythology, showing that even the most advanced air force can be humbled. That achievement will echo not only in Yemen, but across the networks of allies and adversaries who now see Israel differently. For Iran, this is a moment to amplify its narrative of resistance. For Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, this is a moment of deep concern, because if Israel's air superiority can be compromised, so can theirs. For the United States, the implications are far more serious, because the capture of Israeli pilots forces uncomfortable questions about how reliable American military support truly is in an increasingly unpredictable region. The real power of this story lies not only in the facts of the capture, but in the images, the headlines, and the propaganda value it creates. Wars are fought not just with weapons, but with perception, and perception can be far more powerful than firepower. Tonight, Yemeni forces have not only captured Israeli pilots, they have captured the world's attention. And once perception shifts, it is nearly impossible to turn it back. This is why the phrase, Israeli pilots captured in Yemen, has become more than just a headline. It has become a symbol, a signal, and perhaps even a warning of what the future may hold. The capture of Israeli pilots in Yemen is not just an isolated military setback, it is a moment heavy with symbolism, a moment that carries consequences far beyond the battlefield. Israel has long relied on the image of invincibility, its military strength, its technological edge, and above all, its air force, which has been the foundation of that reputation. The pilots represent the cutting edge of that strength, the living proof of Israel's dominance in the skies. And now, for the first time in decades, that image has been cracked in the most public way possible. The symbolism is undeniable. It is not just about the individuals who were captured. It is about the myth of unshakable superiority being challenged in front of the world. That is why this story resonates so deeply and so dangerously across the region. Symbols matter in conflict. They shape how nations see themselves, how adversaries measure their chances, and how allies calculate their trust. For Israel, the capture of its pilots undermines more than just its military edge. It strikes at the very heart of its strategic deterrence. When enemies see that even the most elite and protected figures of Israeli power can fall, it sends a message louder than any speech or declaration. Israel is vulnerable, and vulnerability in the Middle East is a currency no nation can afford to trade in. This single event has handed Israel's adversaries a symbolic victory far greater than the tactical one. Consider for a moment how this plays on the world stage. Israel's military identity has always rested on three pillars: speed, precision, and dominance. These are not just operational features, they are part of the national story, the belief that when Israeli pilots take to the skies, they will return home victorious, untouched. But now that story has been rewritten. And once rewritten, it cannot be undone. Yemen has turned its battlefield success into a narrative weapon, showing the world that David can, in fact, bruise Goliath. And in the information age, that story spreads faster and penetrates deeper than any military communique. There is also the matter of morale. Inside Israel, the symbolic power of its pilots has always been a source of national pride. These are not just soldiers, they are seen as guardians of the nation, defenders of its very existence in a hostile neighborhood. Their capture cuts into that pride and forces a painful reckoning. For the families watching, for the soldiers serving, for the citizens who have long trusted in the promise of security through strength, this moment feels like a rupture in the story they have believed for decades. That rupture cannot be easily repaired, no matter how quickly the government or military responds. Meanwhile, for Israel's adversaries, the symbolism works in the opposite direction. It emboldens them, feeding into the narrative that resistance can achieve the unthinkable. Across Tehran, Beirut, Damascus, and Sana'a, the capture of Israeli pilots is being celebrated not merely as a tactical gain, but as proof of resilience against overwhelming force. The symbolic victory becomes a rallying cry, one that strengthens alliances, deepens resolve, and shifts calculations about what is possible in this long, grinding conflict. It is one thing to fight an enemy you believe to be invincible. It is another to fight one you have just seen stumble. The psychological power of this moment cannot be overstated. Wars are never only about weapons and strategies, they are about stories, images, and perceptions. The symbolism of Israeli pilots, symbols of mastery, symbols of superiority, being paraded as captives is a narrative that no press release can erase. It is the kind of story that lingers, the kind that shapes not only the present conflict, but the way future battles are imagined. And that, perhaps more than any military loss, is what makes this capture a turning point. The capture of Israeli pilots in Yemen is not a story confined within the borders of those two nations. Its impact is radiating outward, reaching every capital in the region and forcing leaders, strategists, and intelligence agencies to confront a new reality. In Tehran, this development will be framed as vindication. For years, Iran has poured resources into supporting the Houthi movement in Yemen, positioning it as part of its broader strategy of resistance against Israel and U.S. influence. The news that Yemeni forces were able to bring down Israeli aircraft and capture its pilots will be celebrated as proof that Iran's investment is yielding results. Tehran will seize this moment to amplify its message that resistance works, that even the strongest enemies can be humbled, and that alliances with Iran's network can shift the balance of power in the region. This is more than just propaganda. It is a strategic victory in the psychological war being fought alongside the physical one. Meanwhile, in Riyadh and the capitals of the Gulf states, the news lands with a very different effect. Saudi Arabia has long considered both Yemen and Iran as existential threats, but it has also counted on Israel's military dominance as part of an informal regional balance. If Israeli air power can be challenged so dramatically in Yemen, then Saudi leaders must ask themselves what this means for their own security. For years, Gulf states have invested heavily in American-made weapons, sophisticated defense systems, and intelligence sharing with Israel. But this moment raises uncomfortable questions. If Israel's highly trained pilots can be captured, what does that say about the effectiveness of shared strategies and joint defenses? In the Gulf, this is not just an Israeli setback, it is a wake-up call. Washington, too, is watching this development with unease. The United States has long positioned itself as Israel's most powerful ally, guaranteeing its security and supporting its military edge. But the capture of Israeli pilots introduces a complication that American policymakers cannot ignore. On one hand, the U.S. must stand firmly with Israel, condemning the capture and working behind the scenes to secure the pilots' release. On the other hand, this event highlights a dangerous reality. Even America's closest partners are not invincible. And if Israel's air power can be challenged, then the credibility of American promises of protection across the region comes into question. For adversaries of the U.S., this is a moment to exploit. For allies, it is a moment of doubt. The ripple effect also extends into Moscow and Beijing, where global powers will view this capture through the lens of opportunity. Russia, already deeply involved in the region through its role in Syria, can point to this moment as evidence of Western vulnerability. China, with its growing economic interests in the Middle East, will see a reminder that the regional landscape is shifting in ways that cannot be ignored. Both nations understand that symbolism drives influence, and both will watch how Washington and Jerusalem respond to decide how aggressively they can press their own agendas. The broader effect, however, is one of recalibration. Every state in the region is recalculating its assumptions about Israel's strength and about the reliability of U.S. guarantees. Enemies see opportunity, allies see risk. The Middle East thrives on these moments of perception where a single event can reset the equations that define war, diplomacy, and survival. The capture of Israeli pilots is precisely that kind of moment. It is not contained, it is radiating outward, destabilizing the assumptions that have held the region in a fragile balance. And in a part of the world where perception often dictates reality, that ripple effect may prove even more dangerous than the event itself. In Washington, the capture of Israeli pilots in Yemen has set off alarms at the highest levels of government. The United States has built its entire Middle East strategy on the assumption that Israel is not only a reliable ally, but also a military power capable of defending itself with unmatched precision. That assumption has now been challenged in the most dramatic way. When Israeli pilots, symbols of the very edge of Western technology and training, are taken captive, it forces American policymakers to ask hard questions about the limits of their own guarantees. How can Washington project strength to allies when its closest partner has just been exposed in such a public way? That is the uncomfortable reality being debated behind closed doors tonight. For decades, U.S. support for Israel has been framed as ironclad, billions of dollars in military aid. Intelligence sharing at the highest levels and diplomatic cover on the world stage have all been part of that commitment. But this moment shows that even with all that support, vulnerabilities remain, and vulnerabilities are contagious. Allies who depend on U.S. security commitments, from Saudi Arabia to Jordan, from the Gulf monarchies to Egypt, are watching closely. If Israel, with all its advantages, can be humbled in this way, what does that say about the protection America promises to others? This is not just about Israel's security, it is about the credibility of U.S. power itself. The pressure on Washington comes from multiple directions. On one side, there will be calls for immediate and visible action, stronger military backing for Israel, perhaps even covert operations to help recover the captured pilots. On the other side, there will be voices warning against being dragged deeper into a regional conflict that has already proven resistant to American solutions. The Biden administration, or any U.S. administration in this situation, finds itself caught between the need to demonstrate resolve and the risk of escalation. Every move is being calculated not just in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, but in Tehran, Moscow, and Beijing, where adversaries are eager to see how the U.S. handles this crisis. There is also a domestic angle. In American politics, support for Israel is a constant, but the debate over how far that support should go has grown sharper in recent years. The images of captured Israeli pilots will intensify that debate. Some will argue that this proves the need for an even stronger military partnership, that America must double down on its commitments to ensure Israel's security. Others will say that this is evidence of the dangers of overcommitment, that America cannot guarantee the security of others when even its closest ally has been shown to be vulnerable. The capture, then, becomes not only a foreign policy challenge, but a political flashpoint at home. For America's rivals, the message is clear: U.S. influence is not absolute. Tehran will emphasize that American-backed forces are not unbeatable. Moscow will use this as another example of Western decline. Beijing will quietly note that America's system of alliances is not as unshakable as it appears. And for adversaries like Hezbollah or Hamas, this is an opportunity to argue that even the best-equipped militaries in the world can be brought down. The U.S., which has relied on Israel as a cornerstone of its Middle East strategy, now faces the reality that its cornerstone has shown cracks. And yet, it is not only adversaries who are recalculating. America's allies, too, are taking notes. In Riyadh, in Abu Dhabi, in Amman, leaders who depend on Washington's assurances are wondering whether those assurances are as ironclad as they have been told. If Israel, the showcase ally, can be made vulnerable, then what about them? This is how credibility unravels. Not in dramatic declarations, but in moments like this, when perception shifts and doubt spreads silently through diplomatic channels. What makes this moment so consequential for Washington is that it strikes at the heart of what American power is supposed to represent: certainty, reliability, deterrence. The capture of Israeli pilots in Yemen disrupts all of that. It shows that even the strongest alliances can be tested, that even the most advanced militaries can be shaken. And as America grapples with how to respond, the world is watching not just for action, but for proof that U.S. power still means what it once did. The capture of Israeli pilots in Yemen is not simply a military development, it is an act of psychological warfare with consequences that extend far beyond the battlefield. Wars are fought with weapons, but they are also fought with perception, and in this case, perception may be even more powerful than the weapons themselves. By capturing Israeli pilots, figures long seen as untouchable and elite Yemeni forces have created an image that will reverberate in news cycles, political speeches, and propaganda campaigns across the globe. This is not just a setback for Israel, it is a story that adversaries will use to question the very foundation of Israeli and Western strength. And stories, once they take hold, can be harder to defeat than armies. Consider the visual power of this moment. A pilot, once imagined as the symbol of control in the skies, is suddenly shown as vulnerable, captured, powerless. These images, whether still photographs, video clips, or even verbal accounts, carry a force that no military briefing can erase. They will be broadcast across Arab media, circulated on social networks, and celebrated in anti-Israeli demonstrations. They will become the rallying cry of those who have long argued that resistance, no matter how uneven the fight, can achieve results. It is a powerful hook. If Israeli pilots can be captured, then nothing is impossible. That idea, once planted, can spread like wildfire, emboldening fighters, hardening political positions, and reshaping public opinion. Inside Israel, the psychological impact is equally significant. The Air Force is not just a military branch, it is a symbol of the nation's survival, a constant reminder that no matter how many enemies surround them, Israel has the strength to defend itself from above. The capture of pilots pierces that confidence, raising questions about vulnerability in the minds of ordinary citizens. Families who once believed their sons and daughters were protected by the most advanced Air Force in the region are now confronted with the reality that even the best trained can fall. That realization can erode morale, not only in households, but also within the ranks of the military itself. Soldiers and officers alike are forced to grapple with the uncomfortable truth that the invincible can, in fact, be defeated. For Israel's enemies, the psychological payoff is immense. Groups like Hezbollah, Hamas, and other regional actors will use this moment to bolster recruitment, increase funding, and rally supporters. They will point to the captured pilots as evidence that determination can overcome technology, that persistence can crack even the strongest defenses. The message is simple but potent: Israel is not invincible. And that message, repeated often enough, becomes a weapon in itself. It shifts the balance of confidence on the battlefield long before the next shot is fired. The psychological warfare extends to Israel's allies as well. In Washington, in European capitals, and in the Gulf states, leaders must now wrestle with how to explain this moment. If Israel can be exposed in such a way, then the broader Western-led security architecture in the Middle East looks weaker. The perception of weakness is dangerous because it invites testing. Adversaries who might have hesitated before may now be emboldened to act, believing that the walls protecting Israel and its allies are not as strong as they once seemed. In this way, a single capture can create ripples of doubt that undermine the very stability alliances are built upon. What makes this so powerful is the asymmetry. Israel can deploy airstrikes, advanced drones, and cyber capabilities, but none of those tools can erase the image of captured pilots. Military power has limits when stacked against human imagination, and the imagination of adversaries is now fueled by this story. In Tehran, strategists will highlight it as evidence that their regional network is succeeding. In Sana'a, it will be presented as proof of defiance against overwhelming odds. And in living rooms across the region, ordinary people who once feared Israeli air dominance may now feel inspired by the idea that even giants can stumble. The truth is that wars are often decided as much in the mind as on the battlefield. Confidence, morale, and perception can shape outcomes in ways no weapon system can predict. The capture of Israeli pilots has become a psychological victory for Israel's adversaries and a psychological wound for Israel and its allies. That is why this event is not just a tactical story, it is a strategic one. It reshapes narratives, it alters perceptions, and it proves once again that in modern conflict, images and stories can be as devastating as missiles and bombs. Tonight, uncertainty is the only certainty. With Israeli pilots now in Yemeni custody, the future lies suspended between negotiation, escalation, and the haunting prospect of a risky rescue mission. Each option carries with it enormous consequences, not only for Israel, but for the entire region. This is the kind of moment where leaders are forced to choose not just a course of action, but the story that will define their nation in the eyes of the world. And the hooks are powerful. Will Israel strike back with overwhelming force? Will quiet diplomacy bring its pilots home? Or will a daring rescue operation attempt to rewrite this narrative? Every possibility is on the table, and every possibility is fraught with danger. The first and perhaps most politically charged option is negotiation. History tells us that captured soldiers often become bargaining chips, traded for concessions, prisoners, or guarantees. If Israel were to pursue a deal, it would almost certainly come at a steep price, one that might involve the release of high-profile detainees or diplomatic compromises that Tel Aviv has long resisted. But the mere act of negotiating carries symbolic weight. For Israel, agreeing to terms set by Yemeni forces would signal weakness, a concession to groups it has historically dismissed as illegitimate. And yet, for the families of the captured pilots, negotiation is not weakness, it is survival. The government would find itself pulled between the raw emotion of its citizens and the cold calculation of its security establishment. The second option is escalation. Israel has never shied away from using overwhelming force to send a message. Airstrikes against Yemeni targets, the deployment of special units, or even regional operations could be launched as a show of strength, a signal that the capture of its pilots will not go unanswered. But escalation is not a simple choice. Yemen is not Gaza and it is not southern Lebanon. The geography, the complexity of its ongoing war, and the heavy influence of Iran make it a theater where Israeli forces could easily become entangled in ways they do not control. Escalation risks turning a symbolic defeat into a protracted conflict, one that could spiral far beyond the initial incident. And here is the hook. Would such a move restore Israel's deterrence, or would it prove once more that even overwhelming power cannot prevent entrapment in a conflict without end? Then there is the third and most dangerous path, a rescue operation. Israel has a long history of daring missions that have become legendary. Entebbe in 1976, for example, when commandos freed hostages from Uganda. Such operations are etched into Israeli identity as proof of ingenuity and courage. Attempting something similar in Yemen would appeal to that national narrative, offering the chance to flip humiliation into triumph. But the risks are staggering. Yemen is a hostile environment layered with militias, tribes, and foreign backers. Any failed rescue would not only endanger the lives of the pilots, but also deepen the humiliation. In the age of instant media, a failed operation would be broadcast in real time, magnifying the damage to Israel's reputation. Success could restore pride, but failure would magnify defeat. That is the gamble, a gamble where the stakes could not be higher. Internationally, each option Israel considers will ripple outward. If it negotiates, it signals to the world that even Israel must bend under pressure, emboldening adversaries everywhere. If it escalates, it risks drawing the United States and regional allies deeper into conflict, creating wider instability. If it gambles on a rescue, the entire world will watch in suspense, waiting to see whether Israel can live up to its own history of military daring. Each path forces not just a strategic decision, but a decision about perception, narrative, and image, and perception in this moment may be the most decisive battlefield of all. The truth is, Israel does not have the luxury of time. Every day that passes with its pilots in captivity strengthens Yemen's hand, emboldens its allies, and chips away at Israel's aura of control. Delay itself becomes dangerous because hesitation looks like weakness, and weakness in the Middle East invites testing. That is why tonight's uncertainty is not a pause, it is a ticking clock. Every minute without resolution sharpens the pressure, heightens the stakes, and raises the risks of whatever comes next. This is the kind of moment that defines leaders and reshapes nations. And tonight, Israel stands at that crossroads, its next move set to echo across the region and the world.